Hail Admirals, and welcome to the Discerning Gamer. The Emperor protects. Ironic to say that as we watch Cadia getting destroyed. Anyway guys, welcome back. I want to talk about Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 today. It's a game that I'm definitely hyped for. I've really enjoyed the first one, but I have a major concern about, and that's the multiplayer. The first game had a brilliant single player campaign, great narrative elements, lore-wise, aesthetically, it ticked all the boxes, the mechanics were good, but I remember just after release having to queue for ages to find a game. The player base for the multiplayer just, I would say, dropped off dramatically, / didn't even really exist, and even to this day there isn't replay functionality built into the game, and as we all know, replays are the cornerstone of any competitive or multiplayer scene for an RTS game. So with the second game coming out, I wanted to look back at what the first one did with its multiplayer and try and find out what it did wrong and perhaps put forward some ideas on how the second one can improve on that. And importantly, I want to know what you guys think as a potential player base. So let me know what you think of my ideas in the comments, and let me know if you think there are key things that I've missed or that they need to fix to get the multiplayer right for the second game. So the first thing I want to touch on is the leveling system. And in the first game, that was that when you wanted to play multiplayer, at least in the beginning, you had to create a captain, and they had envisaged this leveling system where you'd start off with a very small force of cruisers, and then you'd be able to level them up, improve the crew, improve the various modules of the ship and specialize it. However, how this really translated into the game was that you could literally be going into conflicts and having to grind through levels against players who just had flat better stuff than you. You could play your little heart out and really never stand a chance of winning against a competent foe because they had just played longer than you and got a higher level ship. And I think that put a lot of people, at least, you know, serious multiplayer candidates, off the game to start off with. And it also meant that if you were getting frustrated or losing, it's not like you could go to a community website and look up a good build order or something like that, because the answer would simply be you're just going to have to play some games where you probably lose or take heavy losses or what have you until you get to a point where you can actually play the game as it was intended to be played. And I think that's quite a steep barrier to entry for any multiplayer experience. I would suggest that this is replaced by a points system similar to Wargame or Steel Division, where each player has a limited pool of points and they can pick all of the crafts and upgrades for those crafts by spending those points. And that makes it a much more simple exercise for balancing, but also retains some of the flexibility, so that if you wanted to build a swarm of escorts and light cruisers, or a smaller force of just battleships or carriers, then you have the flexibility to do that, and the points are what balance that out for you. It sounds like the developers are making steps towards this by standardizing what each player can pick and having 2 upgrade slots for their admiral ship to give them special powers, and 2 universal buffs for the rest of the fleet. So you might choose that they could all go through an asteroid field, or they all have a quicker recharging shield or something along those lines. And I like that because it adds an element of choice to and customization, which, you know, makes the game much more personal, makes it more interesting over the long term, but hopefully it also retains some of the balance. That information, by the way, is from Chapter Master Valrak's interview with the developers, which I highly recommend you check out on YouTube. Another problem was the game modes. When you matched up with an opponent, you were randomly selected a game mode from a list that could include things like defending a space station or escorting a colony, but by far the fairest and most preferred game mode by the community was straight up deathmatch, or cruiser clash I believe they call it. This was again a problem because it favoured some factions over others, and also it just added sort of unnecessary complication and detracted from the main elements that people enjoyed about the game. I don't mind having them in there as an option to play as, but I think having them intrinsically intertwined with the core game mode was probably a mistake. A well-intentioned mistake, because it was trying to stay faithful to the core tabletop, as they were all modes that appeared in the tabletop. However, the developers have since admitted that they're going to be focusing on Cruiser Clash as the main game mode. This is a welcome change, and I'd even actually suggest that putting in some sort of Company of Heroes style capture points and victory points ticker would be a good change as well, because that would mean that there's no tension between who's going to attack first and put themselves at a potential disadvantage by doing that, and it also stops one side from simply camping or hiding or kiting. And also, you know, battles often happen not just for the sake of destroying the enemy, but for claiming some sort of strategically important objective. On the topic of maps, I think that the maps in the first game were actually randomly generated, and as a result, though the backgrounds were often quite striking, they did tend to be somewhat featureless and plain. In the sequel, I'd like to see a series of actually designed maps that have got many more terrain features, are probably a bit larger than the ones we see currently, and just have some sort of distinct elements to them. I'm imagining battling around small moons, in large asteroid fields, around a broken up space hulk, something along those lines. And just because then it's another layer of strategic and tactical depth and decision making that will give the game longer legs and also a bit more character and flavour as well. Imagine, for example, if you bought an escort heavy army list, or fleet list I should say, and you were able to then navigate to parts of the map that larger capital ships weren't able to get to, and it opened up strategic possibilities along those lines. In Valrak's interview, he did say that the developers have already started considering putting in more terrain features that perhaps can be destroyed and alter as the course of the battle goes on. So it sounds like they've got their right idea in mind, but I'd like to see that develop through to actual proper recognisable RTS maps, because I think there's just something charming and memorable and also useful from a point of view of strategy and community building to have a set of well-balanced, memorable, striking maps to play on. The final bit I wanted to talk about is actually some of the core game mechanics. And while I really enjoyed playing the game, particularly from a single player point of view, I think from a multiplayer perspective, it perhaps became a little bit too MOBA-ish in that there was, for each of your ships, if you were playing with a fully teched out army, which I'm not in this gameplay, but that you ended up having multiple abilities per ship, and it ended up being more like you were dancing specific ships around and having to activate lots of abilities. And then when you got two fully developed fleets clashing into each other, there was this sort of sensory overload almost of pie templates going down, of huge explosions which you couldn't know what was a stasis bomb, what was a disruption bomb, what was a plasma bomb, and you know what was aimed weapons fire from some of the ships, and it was all just a little bit overwhelming. This combined with kind of the speed of the game, I think sometimes people found it a little bit too floaty, a little bit bumper car-ish in the way that it was animated or the speed of the ships was portrayed. I think with Battlefleet Gothic, people want something that's a bit more of a stately procession of these enormous ships where perhaps they take a little bit longer to turn. I don't think too much slower than what we see in the game currently, but just something that has a little bit more finality and decision and isn't something that once you've committed to a course, it's more difficult to get out of it. I think this combined with the bigger fleet sizes that we're going to see in Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 will provide a different experience of perhaps something where you're worrying about your entire fleet rather than microing in a MOBA fashion just some key units around. I think it would be better, and I suspect it may be something that we see in the second game, that the cruisers and less important capital ships actually behave more like typical RTS units, where perhaps they just have one ability each and they behave in a more recognisable pattern. You're not then expected to try and guess what abilities each of these ships have got, what favours they've been given, what upgrades they've been taken. Perhaps they behave in just a more uniform manner with the two upgrades taken across the whole fleet as the only variables to factor in from match to match. And this would also mean that it would be much larger to control a whole fleet, and then you'd be able to get these big epic space battles, but without the stress of having to go to each individual unit and try and micro all of its subsystems, its abilities, its repair, its boarding, its, you know, various bombs or micro warp jumps or whatever else it might have on board by the time you've leveled each individual ship up. I think that stuff works much better in a single player environment than it does in a multiplayer. I'm almost imagining it working just a little bit more like Total War, for example. And I think the developers knew perhaps that they had created something that was a bit unwieldy, and the fact that we had Tactical Cogitator, which allowed you to slow the game down and provide different orders to all of these units, was perhaps actually a nod to the fact that, yeah, it was a bit hectic, and that was perhaps an inelegant way for them to solve that issue. Anyway, everything that we've heard so far via Chapter Master Valrak has been very promising, I think, and it sounds like we're heading in a good direction. It just remains to be seen through later communication as to how much they're going to change these core game systems. I suspect actually that in the first game they tried perhaps a little bit too hard to sandwich all of these systems from the tabletop into the computer game, and I think perhaps now they've had success with the first game, they'll just be a little bit more daring in the changes that they're willing to make perhaps. Anyway, I'm really interested to know what you guys are hoping for in the way of changes for the sequels. Do you think I've kind of hit the nail on the head with the things that tripped up the first game's multiplayer experience, or is there something different? I think if we can make a bit of an ongoing conversation of this, it would be extremely useful and hopefully even catch the eyes of the developers, and something that we can refer back to as we learn more about the game and hopefully get into the beta test. So let me know what's going on down in the comments. I might make a comment response video if there's a good discussion going on down there. Likewise, my Discord is linked in the video description, so we can have a chat on there as well about it. Otherwise, guys, thank you very much for watching. There'll be more content in the channel, so if you're enjoying it, please drop me a like and subscribe for more. Otherwise, until next time.